Have you ever found yourself, you know, deep in a discussion, maybe trying to prove a point, or even just trying to properly get your head around someone else's perspective? And then you suddenly realize there's this whole, like, hidden blueprint under their words that's not just what we say, but really how we say it. And maybe most importantly, how we actually expect that statement to be judged by everyone else.
That's exactly the fascinating territory we're exploring today, really digging into it. We're embarking on a deep dive into the very architecture of arguments. How they're built, how they're assessed, and how we genuinely come to understand them. Our insights today are largely drawn from Stephen Toulmin's really groundbreaking work, The Uses of Argument. Specifically, we're looking at his chapter on fields of argument and modals. Our mission, really, is to shine a light on the nuanced ways we make and evaluate claims, and maybe help you understand why what counts as a good argument in one situation might seem completely off or even flawed in another.
Right. So whether you're, say, prepping for a big meeting, or trying to grapple with a dense research paper, or maybe you're just curious about how we reason and persuade each other, this deep dive should give you a kind of shortcut. You'll gain some practical tools, hopefully, to quickly spot the underlying logic, or sometimes maybe the surprising lack of logic in the claims you hear every day. This isn't just abstract stuff. It's really about becoming a sharper, more critical thinker in, well, a world that's just full of information. Okay, so the source material kicks off by talking about what happens when someone makes an assertion. And now, on the surface, that sounds pretty simple, doesn't it? Just stating something. But Toulmin suggests it's actually much more significant than that. It's the real starting block for any argument. So what exactly is an assertion in this context?
Yeah, you've hit on a really crucial starting point there. At its core, an assertion isn't just, a casual remark. It's a deliberate move forward. It's a conscious claim on our attention. When someone asserts something, they're making a statement, and there's this implicit expectation that it should be taken seriously, that it has some weight. The text highlights this really vividly, saying that the claim implicit in an assertion is like a claim to a right or to a title.
Right.
So imagine someone staking a claim to land or asserting a legal right. They're saying, I have a right to this, recognize it.
Ah, okay, so it's like saying, I have the grounds to say this.
Exactly. In the same way, when you assert something, you're implicitly claiming you have the justification, the backing, the right to make that statement, and you expect others to acknowledge its merits.
That's a really powerful distinction. It's not just words, it's words with backing implied.
Precisely. And that fundamentally separates a genuine assertion from, say, someone just joking around or hypothesizing with a what if, or let's suppose. When someone makes a real assertion, they're kind of putting their intellectual credibility out there. They want to be taken seriously. Now, sure, some people, established experts might be trusted almost instantly because of their reputation. But for Toulmin, and for our deep dive today, it's less about who is speaking and more about the fundamental question of their right to make that claim and whether we as listeners can be confident that their assertion is actually well-founded.
So the confidence comes from the argument behind it.
Exactly. That confidence, the text tells us, ultimately hinges on having a sound, robust case behind the statement, a case that genuinely earns the statement the right to our attention and the merits it claims. So the seriousness we should give an assertion and the speaker's right to make it are really dependent on the merits of the argument that supports it. It's all about the scaffolding, not just the front display.
Right. And as we get deeper into this, what's really striking is just the sheer variety of examples the source uses. To show all these different kinds of assertions, it's not just philosophers debating abstract ideas. This stuff applies to pretty much everything we do, every day. It makes you realize how often we're making or hearing assertions without thinking about their structure.
Yeah, and this brings up a really critical question for us. What's the actual difference in argument terms between, say, a meteorologist predicting rain tomorrow, an injured worker claiming negligence, a historian defending Emperor Tiberius, or a doctor diagnosing measles?
They all sound like assertions, but they feel worlds apart.
They are all assertions, absolutely, claims on our attention. But the text points out that the nature of the particular assertion is what dictates the specific kind of support needed, and crucially, how its merits are ultimately judged, how we decide if it's a good assertion. And this idea perfectly sets up one of the main themes today, this concept of the field dependence of arguments.
Okay, let's break that down a bit more. Take the meteorologist predicting rain. What kind of argument is underpinning that?
Right. So a meteorologist's prediction relies heavily on, well, complex atmospheric data, sophisticated weather models, established scientific principles. The backing for that assertion is mostly quantitative, probabilistic. They're essentially saying, based on these measurements and simulations, there's, say, a 70% chance of rain.
Mm-hmm.
And the criteria for judging how good that assertion is involve the accuracy of their models, the reliability of the data they used.
And how does that compare to, say, the injured workman's claim? That feels completely different.
Oh, absolutely. It's a totally different field. An injured worker alleging employer negligence is making a legal assertion. That requires a whole different set of evidence. Maybe witness statements, safety regulations, medical reports, and importantly, legal precedents from past cases. The whole process of supporting and assessing that claim happens in a specific legal context, usually a courtroom, following formal rules of evidence. The standards of proof, the ways you can critique it, they're distinct from meteorology.
Vastly different context then. What about the historian defending Tiberius? That's about character, reputation, events long past. How does that work?
Exactly. A historian defending Tiberius's character. That moves into an even more interpretive area. Their argument will draw on historical records, maybe archaeology, ancient texts, and careful interpretation of sources that are often, incomplete or biased.
Huh.
So the assessment criteria here involve historical accuracy, understanding the context of the Roman Empire, and really the ability to build a persuasive narrative from often just fragments of evidence.
And the doctor diagnosing measles, where does that fit?
A doctor diagnosing measles relies on a mix of science and direct observation. Their medical knowledge, the patient's symptoms, maybe lab tests, their own clinical experience. Their assertion, this person has measles, is based on established scientific and empirical evidence, and its merits are judged by medical standards, diagnostic protocols. It's another distinct field.
And the source just keeps piling on examples, doesn't it?
Mhm.
A businessman questioning a client's honesty, an art critic praising paintings, a claim about a tennis team, Crippen's murder conviction, Sir Kenneth Clark on Piero della Francesca, then jumping to Professor Froehlich's theory of superconductivity predicting an eclipse, even Euclid and Pythagoras, it really drives home the sheer breadth.
It absolutely does. Each of these, even though they're all assertions, demands a unique kind of evidence and backing, and each is judged by totally distinct criteria. Let's just quickly run through a few more. The businessman questioning honesty. That relies on financial records, maybe past behavior patterns. The field is business ethics, maybe accounting.
Right.
The art critic on Tiro della Francesca, that's based on aesthetic principles, art history, maybe subjective sensibility. The field is art criticism, very different.
Okay.
A claim about the Davis Cup team. Player stats, past performance, maybe team dynamics. That's the field of sports analysis.
More informal, but still with its own logic.
Exactly. Crippen's conviction. That was a legal assertion. Forensic evidence, testimony, criminal law procedures, judged within the legal system field.
Very formal.
Professor Froehlich's theory. That needs experimental data, theoretical consistency, peer review within physics. A highly specialized scientific field.
Makes sense. Predicting
An eclipse. Astronomical calculations, laws of celestial mechanics. The field is astrophysics.
Precise prediction.
And of course, Pythagoras' theorem in Euclid, that's pure mathematics. Proof comes from axioms, definitions, logical deduction, a completely abstract field.
Wow.
So what you learn from all this is you just cannot apply the same standards of evidence or reasoning to a historical argument as you would to a math proof or to a medical diagnosis. The fundamental nature of the claim dictates how you justify it and how you assess it, and that really sets the stage for everything else we need to discuss.
Okay, so often when we think about arguments, we picture these very formal, maybe rigid structures, right? Like a debate club or a courtroom scene or maybe a philosophy paper. Very structured. But the source material suggests there's a much more maybe fundamental and practical purpose to argument. Something beyond just winning or proving a point formally. What is that?
That's a really crucial insight that Toulmin brings forward. He clarifies that while, yes, arguments are used for the formal defense of an outright assertion, their primary function is actually much broader, more subtle. It's for grading, assessing, and criticizing them. And this point is absolutely vital, I think. Arguments aren't just about winning or being right. They are fundamentally about understanding how a claim is justified, what makes it a good claim, and how do we evaluate its strengths, its weaknesses, maybe its limitations.
So it's about judging the quality of the reasoning behind the claim, not just whether it's ultimately declared true or false.
Exactly. It's about the justificatory arguments brought forward in support of assertions. looking at the structures they may be expected to have, the merits they can claim, and the ways in which we set about grading, assessing, and criticizing them, unquote. The source really emphasizes that the function of arguments in the business of making good claims is a significant and interesting one. So the fundamental question Toulmin is asking, and what we're really digging into today, is this: how does someone actually produce an argument to defend their assertion? And what are the right ways, the appropriate modes for criticizing and assessing the merits of that argument? It's really about learning how to navigate this huge, varied landscape of human claims and understanding the appropriate way to scrutinize each one you encounter. This shifts our focus, doesn't it? From just the outcome of an argument to the process, the justification, and the evaluation.
Okay, so what does this really mean in practice? If arguments aren't just one size fits all, how do we even start to navigate this variety of purposes the source keeps mentioning? It sounds like we need, I don't know, a different toolkit for every single situation.
That's the critical takeaway, exactly. If we connect this to the bigger picture, it means the whole process of judging the merits, the goodness of an argument, it varies hugely. It all depends on the fundamental nature of the claim being made. The source illustrates this so well by observing that there's a great range of assertions for which backing can be produced, the many different sorts of thing which can be produced as backing for assertions. Quote, and accordingly, the variety of the steps, from the data to conclusions which may appear in the course of justificatory arguments. This inherent variety, this diversity, is the absolute key to understanding how we effectively assess different kinds of claims.
Can you give us a concrete example of how that varied assessment actually plays out?
Sure. The text mentions how we may venture an opinion expressing ourselves in favor of Budge Patty. Now, Budge Patty was a tennis player, so forming an opinion about him might be based on watching him play, looking at his stats, maybe just a gut feeling about his style. It's a relatively informal assessment, right? Drawing on common knowledge, sports fandom, the criteria are pretty fluid.
Okay, but then, contrasting that, arguing against Crippen's conviction for murder. That's a completely different level of scrutiny, surely.
Oh, absolutely. Worlds apart. Arguing against Crippen's conviction, that requires a deep dive, a thorough reevaluation of specific legal evidence, understanding legal procedures, forensics, maybe presenting new information or alternative interpretations, all within a very formal legal framework. The standards of proof, the valid ways to argue in a courtroom, they're incredibly strict, meticulously defined. You can't just rely on a gut feeling about a legal conviction like you might with a tennis player.
And it seems like being skeptical about an art critic's claims, or maybe provisionally accepting a scientific theory, also falls somewhere on the spectrum, but with their own distinct rules again.
Spot on. Being skeptical of, say, Sir Kenneth Clarke's claims about art. That would involve evaluating his aesthetic judgments against maybe other critical views, analyzing different interpretations of the art itself, drawing on a wide knowledge of art history and theory. The argument happens within the often subjective yet still rigorous field of art criticism. It's about justifying aesthetic taste.
Still rigorous, but different from law or tennis.
Exactly. And then provisionally accepting Professor Fröhlich's theory of superconductivity. That means evaluating it based on scientific rigor. Is it internally consistent? Does it explain observations? Does it make successful predictions? Does it fit with other established physics laws? These are entirely different demands on the data, the facts, the evidence. The specific features of our assessment procedure will inevitably change as we move from one kind of assertion to another, because the ways in which we set about considering the merits of arguments may be expected to vary so incredibly widely. So what this really means for you, the listener, is that recognizing the fundamental type of assertion you're dealing with. That's step one to understanding how to properly evaluate its justification. It's like, having different assessment tools for being a chef versus being an architect. Both require skill, but the tools and standards are totally different.
Okay, so after exploring all these diverse assertions, the source introduces a really, really important technical term: a field of arguments. What exactly defines this field, and why is it so critical for us to get our heads around this concept?
Right. A field of arguments is essentially a specific domain, a domain where arguments share fundamental similarities in their logical type. And maybe more importantly, they're judged by the same underlying canons or standards of reasoning. Think of it like a specific game, maybe chess or basketball. Each has its own unique set of rules for what counts as a valid move, right?
Okay, that makes sense. A game with rules.
Exactly. So, for example, the arguments made very carefully in a court of law belong to one distinct field, while the rigorous proofs you find in pure mathematics belong to a completely different field. The text gives us a clear definition. We will be said to belong to the same field when the data and conclusions in each of the two arguments are, respectively, of the same logical type. And they come from different fields when the backing or the conclusions are not of the same logical type.
So it's about the kind of evidence and the kind of conclusion.
Precisely. The fundamental nature of the evidence you're allowed to bring in, and the kinds of conclusions you can legitimately draw from that evidence. They have to be similar for arguments to be considered within the same field. For instance, those intricate proofs in Euclid's elements, like the Pythagorean theorem, they belong firmly in the field of mathematical geometry. There, logical deduction from defined axioms is basically the only acceptable way to justify something.
Oh, to your logic.
Yeah, but then you take the complex calculations used to prepare the nautical almanac, which predicts astronomical positions years ahead with incredible accuracy. That belongs to a totally different field, one based on observational data, physical laws, predictive algorithms. The criteria for assessing if an argument is valid or sound will be fundamentally different between these two fields. Even though both involve incredibly rigorous reasoning, it's about understanding the underlying operating system, if you like, of the argument. Illustrating field dependence with rich examples.
Okay, let's really unpack this because the source provides such a wonderfully varied, almost, I don't know, quirky mix of examples to show just how profoundly different these fields can be. It really hammers home the point that what works in one area might be completely irrelevant or even just wrong in another. It's like bringing a calculator to an art critique.
That's a great analogy. You've got it exactly. And this brings us back to a key question. Just how far can arguments actually take you? And under what specific rules? When you look at these diverse examples Toulmin gives, what really jumps out is the sheer variety of what counts as okay evidence or a valid argument. Whether it's something simple, like the color of Harry's hair, or something complex, like the taxonomic classification of a whale, each domain, each field has its own internal logic, its own specific ways of judging claims.
So let's maybe walk through a few of those examples to really get a feel for the differences.
Absolutely. Let's start simple. Harry's hair is not black, since I know for a fact that it is red. This is direct observation, right? The data is a simple fact from personal knowledge. The field here is just everyday observation, sensory experience. The backing is basically, I saw it, straightforward.
Okay, simple enough.
Now contrast that with Peterson is a Swede, so he is presumably not a Roman Catholic. This isn't direct observation, it's a sociological inference. The backing is general knowledge about demographics in Sweden. It leads to a presumption, notice that word, not a certainty. The field involves social patterns, probabilities, not individual facts. We're dealing with tendencies here.
Right, a generalization, not a hard fact about Peterson himself.
Exactly. Then a scientific one. This phenomenon cannot be wholly explained on my theory, since the deviations between your observations and my predictions are statistically significant. Here, the data are observations, but the backing involves statistical tests, scientific method. The criteria for judgment are things like statistical significance, a theory's explanatory power, falsifiability. It's the scientific field, very number-driven.
Okay, makes sense.
Different again. This creature is a whale, so it is taxonomically a mammal. This is biology, specifically classification. The backing is established taxonomic rules, definitions. The conclusion comes from accepted scientific classification. It's about shared, defined categories.
A matter of definition within science.
Yep. Now let's jump to law. Defendant was driving at 45 mph in a built-up area, so he has committed an offense against the Road Traffic Acts. This is legal, factual, data is the speed, backing is the specific law. Judgment relies on legal interpretation, evidence presented in court following legal rules. The truth is defined by the legal framework.
Got it. Legal field.
And then there's something like a troop of cavalry in red jackets were thudding along. This sounds historical, maybe anecdotal. Backing would be eyewitness accounts, diaries, historical records. It's about establishing a plausible past event, often relying on interpretation, corroboration, not direct proof like the speed limit case.
More interpretive again?
Then, a fox's tail is not a caudal appendage. This is zoology. anatomy. The criteria are precise biological terms, anatomical accuracy, a claim about scientific naming conventions.
Very specific terminology.
How about, you can't have a male sister? This is definitional, based on biology and language. The impossibility is baked into the words themselves. It's logic and meaning. A category mistake.
Yeah, that one's pretty fundamental.
And finally, a practical one. You can't get 10,000 people into the town hall. This is about physical capacity, feasibility, backing is space calculation, crowd limits, maybe fire codes. Judgment relies on physical constraints, practical logistics.
Right, simple physics and planning.
So you see, each of these statements, they're all assertions, but they demand profoundly different kinds of support, and they're evaluated against totally distinct standards. This perfectly shows what makes a field of argument distinct, and why you can't just use the same measuring stick for all of them. Hashtag tag tag field invariant versus field-dependent aspects of argument.
Okay, so after digging into all these different fields, it really makes you wonder, is anything actually universal when it comes to arguments? Or is everything just relative to a specific field? Is there some core logic that applies everywhere? Or is it just this patchwork quilt of different reasonings?
That's a truly critical question, and it's where Toulmin introduces a really profound distinction. He asks us to think about which aspects of arguments are field invariant, meaning they apply no matter the subject, and which aspects are field dependent, meaning they change significantly as you move from one field to another. The text puts it very directly. What things about them are field dependent? What things about the modes in which we assess arguments, the standards, the manner in which we qualify our conclusions, are the same regardless of field invariant. Quote, and which of them vary as we move from arguments in one field to arguments in another, field dependent? This is where I think the real power of his framework starts to become clear.
Yeah, this is where it really shifts my perspective. The source contrasts comparing argument standards in a court of law with, say, a mathematical proof, or even predicting a tennis match outcome. And the point isn't that one is better or more logical than the others, but that they're just fundamentally different in their internal logic and how they're validated.
Indeed. And this brings up a critical point about standards of rigor. While pretty much every intellectual field, every game, has its own standards for what counts as rigorous, what rigor itself means is profoundly field-dependent, the kind of mathematical rigor demanded by someone like Isaac Newton or Euler. It simply isn't the same thing as the legal rigor applied by, say, a Lord Chief Justice Goddard.
Can you elaborate on that? How exactly does their rigor differ? They both sound pretty rigorous to me.
They are, but in different ways. For mathematicians like Newton, Euler, Gauss, or Weierstrass, mathematical rigor means achieving absolute logical proof, deriving conclusions from axioms with, ideally, undeniable certainty. Their arguments are judged on internal consistency, formal validity, the complete absence of contradiction. The standard for stringency in their domain is incredibly high. It aims for universal abstract certainty. If there's one tiny logical flaw, the whole thing falls apart.
Okay, so absolute logical perfection.
Pretty much, but the rigor of a Lord Chief Justice Goddard, that operates in a totally different field, legal judgment. Here, rigor means meticulous attention to fair procedure, careful examination of all the evidence presented, strict adherence to legal precedent, unwavering impartiality, all leading to a conclusion based on probabilities and legal sufficiency, like beyond a reasonable doubt, not mathematical certainty. A judge isn't seeking mathematical proof that someone must be guilty. They need sufficient evidence according to legal standards. The standards applied, the rules of the game, are fundamentally different, yet both Newton and Goddard are seen as highly rigorous within their own distinct fields. We just can't apply the standards of one directly to the other without completely misunderstanding what they're trying to achieve. It'd be like, I don't know, judging a poem based on its nutritional value. Both can have quality, but the criteria are just unrelated.
Right, so arguments aren't just static things. They actually evolve, don't they?
Yeah.
Almost like a story unfolding. The source lays out these really interesting phases that an argument tends to go through. It suggests a kind of natural progression, moving from an initial idea towards a more definitive conclusion.
Yes, what's really insightful here is how Toulmin characterizes this process. He shows argumentation moving from an initial stage where you admit lots of possibilities to progressively narrowing those down towards a more definite conclusion. This is the characterization of the stages into which a justificatory argument naturally falls. And understanding this progression helps us see how certainty is gradually built up, or conversely, how certain possibilities get disproven along the way.
Could we maybe walk through a simple everyday example, like, I don't know, trying to figure out why your internet isn't working? See how those phases might actually play out.
Oh, that's a perfect example. Makes it much more concrete. Okay, let's do it. So you're at home, suddenly, no internet. What happens? Stage one, admitting different suggestions. Your first thoughts are probably all over the place, right? Is the router unplugged? Is the whole service down? Did I forget the bill? Is it just my laptop?
Yeah.
You're just brainstorming, acknowledging all the various things that could be wrong. These are your initial candidates for the solution. They don't have to be likely yet, just imaginable.
Okay. Opening up the possibilities.
Stage two, demanding attention for possible solutions. Then some ideas start seeming more serious. You might think, the router might be unplugged. That's a real possibility. At this stage, calling something possible means it has a right to be considered. It's not saying it's true, just that it's relevant, worth checking. You probably wouldn't waste time on a frivolous idea like maybe birds chewed the cable, unless you had a very specific reason to think that.
All right. Focusing on the plausible ones.
Stage three, winnowing down the possibilities. Now you start gathering info. You check the modem, see the lights are green, you realize, okay, it can't be an unplugged router because the lights are clearly on. This is how the list of possible solutions gets narrowed down. Based on observation, reliable new info. You're eliminating the dead ends.
Testing the hypotheses.
Stage four, when a suggestion becomes probably or likely. After ruling out a few things, maybe you remember an email from your ISP about planned maintenance. Now you'd say, okay, it's probably the ISP doing maintenance. This means a provisional acceptance makes sense based on strong evidence. It's not certain yet, but it's the most reasonable guess. You'd likely check their website or call them at this point.
The leading candidate emerges.
Stage five, moving to certainty or necessity. Finally, you call your ISP and they confirm, yes, there's an outage in your area. At this point, the suggestion moves to certainty or necessity. The evidence is compelling, the conclusion feels inescapable, the problem must be the ISP outage.
Okay. Problem solved.
Exactly, and this progression just highlights that arguments are dynamic. They build confidence, rule out alternatives, narrow things down as new info comes in. It's a continuous process of refining your understanding.
We use words like possible, probable, must, cannot constantly, don't we? In just normal conversation. But Toulmin's work really unpacks them. It shows they're much more than just, casual adjectives. They're actually crucial signals. They indicate how strongly a claim is being asserted, and importantly, how we should treat it, how we should respond to it.
Yeah, if we step back for a moment, these modal terms are absolutely central to how we express and understand the force of an argument. To say something is possible, for instance, is to basically concede it has a right to be considered. It implies that a suggestion, based on what we know right now, deserves attention. It shouldn't just be dismissed as irrelevant or silly. So if someone says this is a possible solution, they're essentially saying this idea has enough grounding, even if not proven yet, to be worth looking into. It kind of opens the door for more discussion, more investigation.
And on the flip side, saying something is not possible, that's a really strong dismissal then, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Conversely, saying something is not possible acts to dismiss it as unworthy. It rules it out entirely from consideration. This shows how arguments get managed and critiqued. These terms act like countersuggestions that basically shut down a particular line of thinking. The source gives examples like, that is not possible, or that yet he proceeds. These function as strong counters, taking options off the table. And that concept of frivolity is important here, too. A frivolous suggestion lacks good reasons, so it doesn't deserve serious thought. But if someone makes a suggestion that seems reasonable, they have a perfectly good defense for making it, even if it turns out wrong later. So possibility implies enough grounds to avoid being dismissed out of hand. The source also notes how further information can lead us to dismiss initial possibilities as maybe unaccountably pointed, or just unlikely, even if they seemed okay at first. As that list of possible solutions gets systematically winnowed down, the trustworthiness of what's left naturally increases, guiding us towards more probable or eventually certain conclusions. So these modal terms aren't just about expressing uncertainty or certainty, they fundamentally describe the functions they have when we come to set out our arguments. They guide how we manage, accept, or reject claims within that logical flow. They're like the traffic signals of reasoning.
Okay, this brings us to another really subtle but I think incredibly important distinction that Toulmin draws. The difference between something being truly impossible versus something being merely improper. We definitely mix these up in everyday talk, don't we? Like, we might say, you can't do that, when what we really mean is, you shouldn't do that, or that's against the rules.
You've absolutely hit on a critical point that the source illuminates so well. And it raises a key question for you, the listener, to think about. What kind of constraint are we actually talking about when we use that word cannot? The source makes a clear, vital distinction between impossibility, which relates to inherent logical, physical, or mathematical contradictions, things that just cannot be, and impropriety, which is more about moral, conventional, or legal violations, things that should not be or are not allowed. That common everyday word, cannot, can definitely hide these really different types of constraints. It's a verbal shortcut, but it can lead to misunderstandings if we don't look a bit closer.
Okay, so let's look closer. Can you walk us through some of the examples the source uses to make this distinction clearer?
Absolutely. Let's break down the examples provided. First, impossibilities. These are things fundamentally barred by reality or a defined system, like cannot lift a ton single-handed. That's a clear physical limitation based on human biology, physics, no way around it.
Right, physically impossible.
Or, a fox's tail is not a caudal appendage. This is biological definitional impossibility within zoology. It's about precise scientific classification. Using the wrong term is impossible within that strict definition.
Okay, definitional.
Then there's you can't smoke in this compartment. This one's interesting. It's a rule or regulation, but it functions like a physical impossibility. The rule, backed by authority, makes it impossible to do without consequences. It acts like a real barrier in practice.
Treated as impossible because of the rule.
Exactly. And then the mathematical ones. Irregular heptagon using ruler and compass, or find a rational square root of 2. These are classic mathematical impossibilities. They relate to inherent limits within math systems. Trying them leads to self-contradiction. A rational root of 2 simply doesn't exist mathematically.
Okay, those are pretty clear impossibilities. What about improprieties?
Right. Now for improprieties. Here, the nature of the constraint shifts. These are things that shouldn't happen, aren't allowed, aren't right, according to rules or norms. For example, cannot marry his sister. This is a clear social moral impropriety. It's not physically impossible, but it violates deep societal norms, laws, moral codes. It's about what's not allowed or not right.
Culturally and legally forbidden.
Precisely. Or remember the fox's tail example? In hunting jargon, calling it a tail instead of a brush is a linguistic solecism, an impropriety of term usage. It's not biologically impossible for it to be a tail, but it's improper usage within that specific community, that field. Sounds wrong to insiders.
Breaking a convention of language.
Exactly. Or cannot pay a debt. This is usually a legal impropriety. It means you're legally obliged to pay, and failing to do so breaks a contract or law. It's not usually a physical impossibility of handing over money, but a failure to meet a legal or moral obligation with defined consequences.
A legal failure, not a physical one.
Right. So the key difference is, for an impossibility, the thing is barred by the structure of the universe or the system itself. For an impropriety, it's barred by a rule, a custom, an ethical code, something that could theoretically change, even if it's deeply ingrained. Hashtag field-dependent nature of impossibilities and improprieties.
Okay, so building on that, these impossibilities and improprieties, they aren't just absolute categories then, are they? Their exact meaning and the conditions where you'd apply them seem to depend heavily on the specific context, the field we're in.
That's the absolute critical insight here, yes. And it's where Toulmin's framework really helps. The source emphasizes that the specific criteria, the standards for what counts as an impossibility or an impropriety, are profoundly field-dependent. A physical impossibility, like lifting that ton, belongs to the field of physics, human biology. The standards are physical laws, biological limits. A legal impropriety, like not paying a debt, belongs squarely to the field of law. Its criteria are found in statutes, case law, judicial procedures.
So the field dictates the criteria.
Exactly. Think about other nuances. A physiologically impossible scenario. Maybe a man instantly changing sex, or a younger sister being older than her brother. These are about biological realities governed by their own criteria. Then the linguistic solecism, like the fox's tailbrush example. It's improper within the field of hunting language, judged by its specific conventions. A judicial impropriety might be a judge having a conflict of interest. The criteria are in legal ethics rules. A moral impropriety, like perjury. The reasons for not doing it are based on ethical principles.
So many different kinds of cannot.
Exactly. The underlying meaning of the modal term, it's force, like cannot, always, meaning something is ruled out or not permitted, that might be constant across these different fields. But the standards, the actual yardsticks we use to apply that cannot, whether it's physics, math, social norms, law, ethics, those are not universal. They are entirely dependent on the specific field of argument you're operating within, which means to really evaluate a claim involving cannot or must, you
Uh,
first have to understand which field it belongs to. Otherwise, you're just applying the wrong rules, judging it by the wrong standards, and you'll probably misunderstand it.
This feels like we're getting to the absolute core of this deep dive now, this distinction between the force of a modal term and the criteria for its use. It sounds subtle, but like you said, it seems incredibly powerful for really understanding how we judge arguments. Could you maybe give us a simple way to think about this first, perhaps with an everyday analogy, before we dive into Toulmin's examples?
Oh, that's a great idea because this distinction really is fundamental. Okay, think about the word sharp. Just the word sharp.
Mm.
The force of sharp is always about having a keen edge or a clearly defined point or maybe intensity. It implies effectiveness for cutting or being distinct or being intense. That underlying implication, that force, stays pretty constant no matter what you're describing as sharp.
Okay, sharp always means keen or intense in some way.
Right. But now think about the criteria for what makes something sharp. They change dramatically depending on the context, the field. A sharp knife means it cuts food easily. The criteria are about its physical edge, its cutting ability. A sharp dresser means someone stylish, well put together. The criteria are about fashion, appearance, nothing to do with cutting. A sharp wit means someone intelligent, quick thinking. Criteria are about mental acuity, cleverness. A sharp pain describes an intense, piercing feeling. Criteria relate to sensation intensity. In every case, the force, keenness, distinctness, intensity is kind of there. But the criteria for applying the word sharp change completely with the context. That's basically what Toulmin means by force versus criteria. And it's the key to unlocking how argument evaluation works across different fields.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, so applying that back to Toulmin, what really determines if an argument is strong?
Exactly. So the source defines force as the intrinsic meaning or the practical logical implications of using a modal term. So for cannot, its force always means not allowing or ruling out. It implies this general instruction that something just has to be ruled out in a certain way for a certain reason. This underlying practical implication, this force, stays constant no matter the field. You cannot do this, carries the same general weight of prohibition everywhere.
Okay, the force is the basic meaning, ruled out.
Right. But then you have the criteria. These are the specific standards, the particular grounds, the concrete reasons we use to decide when it's appropriate to actually use that term in a given field. So the force of impossible might be field invariant. It always means cannot be done. But the criteria for what counts as impossible, is it mathematical, not physical, but moral, legal, are definitely field dependent. The text puts it very clearly. The meaning of a modal term, such as cannot, has two aspects. These can be referred to as the force of the term and the criteria for its use. It clarifies that force is the practical implications of its use, while criteria are the standards, grounds, and reasons by reference to which we decide in any context that the use of a particular modal term is appropriate. Getting this distinction is absolutely fundamental to understanding how we rationally assess claims in practice.
And this is where it gets really interesting, I think, because the source applies this whole force versus criteria idea to completely different areas, comparing mathematical impossibility to what makes something good or worthy of praise. It's just a brilliant way to see how this framework operates in practice, bridging the very abstract and the very concrete.
It really is fascinating, isn't it, how the same basic concept of force applies. Yet the criteria for making the judgment shift so dramatically across these different fields. Let's look first at mathematical impossibility. The force of saying something is mathematically impossible is that it inherently leads to a self-contradiction. It means if you try to construct it or assume it's true, you inevitably hit a logical inconsistency within that mathematical system. The implication, the force, is that such a thing just cannot exist or be derived within that system, period.
Okay, for self-contradictory.
Right. But the criteria for demonstrating this impossibility involve formal proofs, established theorems, rigorous logical deductions. For example, proving you can't construct that irregular heptagon with just a ruler and compass, or find a rational square root of 2. The criteria involve specific geometric principles or number theory proofs that show definitively how attempting it leads to a contradiction within those systems, Euclidean geometry, rational numbers. The criteria are purely logical, axiomatic. Very strict.
Got it. So what about judging something as good? How does force versus criteria work there?
Okay, now let's shift to commendation, or what we judge as good.
Yeah.
The force of calling something good is generally that it is worthy of commendation. It implies this thing deserves praise, approval, a positive evaluation. It's seen as desirable or effective in some way. That's the consistent force.
Okay, force worthy of praise.
But the criteria for applying good, they are incredibly diverse, highly variable, and totally field dependent.
So like we said with the sharp example, an apple, a painting, a vacuum cleaner, they can all be good, but the reasons, the criteria are completely different.
Precisely. The criteria for a good apple relate to its taste, sweetness, texture, ripeness. You're judging it by sensory horticultural standards. A good painting, though, is judged by criteria like artistic merit, composition, emotional impact, technical skill, historical significance, all within the field of aesthetics, art history. You wouldn't judge its taste.
Definitely not.
Similarly, a good vacuum cleaner is assessed by its efficiency, suction power, durability, ease of use, maybe noise level, practical, technical criteria from product engineering. And a good city might be judged on architectural beauty, quality of life, infrastructure, cultural vibrancy, a whole complex set of social, economic, and aesthetic criteria.
So many different ways to be good.
Exactly. The text explicitly says the criteria for judging or assessing the merits of different kinds are very variable. It warns it can be misleading or out of place to even try to apply universal criteria for all types of good across these diverse contexts. You just wouldn't judge a painting by the criteria for a vacuum cleaner, even though both can be called good in their own domains. This really highlights that judging and evaluating are far from being uniform activities. They're deeply rooted in the specific practices, standards, and purposes of each field. And understanding this force criteria distinction lets you break down an argument, see its underlying logic, rather than just reacting superficially to the words.
Okay, so stepping back for a moment, after this whole deep dive, it leaves us with some really profound questions, doesn't it, about the very nature of logic itself and how we actually use it. It really makes you ask, is there some grand general logic that applies everywhere, universally? Or is all reasoning, perhaps surprisingly, ultimately field-dependent, tied to its context?
That's a fundamental philosophical debate, and Toulmin's work dives right into it. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the source really pushes us to consider the limitations of a purely geometrical model of logic. You know, that traditional view that seeks universal, formal, abstract rules like mathematical axioms that can be applied to any argument, regardless of what it's about. That view tries to find abstract, field-invariant forms. But Toulmin suggests that while the force of modal terms might be universal, their criteria are deeply rooted in specific human practices and contexts, which makes a purely formal, geometrical logic maybe not the best tool for understanding practical reasoning in the real world.
So instead of logic as rigid geometry, what's the alternative model Toulmin points towards?
He offers a really intriguing rival model. The analogy between rational assessment and judicial practice presents us with a rival model for thinking about the idea of logical form. So instead of picturing logic as a strict geometric proof, imagine it more like a courtroom proceeding. In court, arguments are presented, evidence is weighed carefully, judgments are made based on established procedures and the specifics of the case, which, as we've seen, often differ even between different types of law, like criminal versus civil. This judicial model emphasizes the dynamic, contextual, procedural nature of argument. It's less about abstract forms, more about practical procedures.
Logic is jurisprudence, not geometry.
In a sense, yes. The text does acknowledge that the ambition for a system of logic, field invariant, both in the forms it employs and in the criteria it sets out, is at first sight a wholly reasonable ambition. It sounds great, doesn't it? One universal set of rules for all arguments. But Toulmin's analysis also raises a big concern, that the notions of logic remains impenetrably obscure if we only look at abstract structures. Instead of looking at how arguments actually function in real-world criticism and everyday conversation, this implies that truly understanding logic means engaging with its practical applications, its context, the messy reality of human reasoning. Hashtag implications for understanding information and arguments.
This feels so incredibly relevant to the world we live in now, just saturated with information. It genuinely makes you stop and think twice about how you evaluate the constant stream of claims you encounter, whether it's news reports, research findings, or even just, a heated discussion online.
That's really the core of Toulmin's practical gift to us, I think. The text encourages us to keep asking, what things about the form and merits of our arguments are those which we customarily employ in the practical criticism of everyday arguments? It's a profound call for critical thinking that goes way beyond just surface agreement or disagreement. It suggests that recognizing the field an argument belongs to is absolutely crucial for assessing it properly.
Because the rules are different in each field.
Exactly. We face real difficulty if we try to directly compare questions in totally different domains, say mathematics versus cosmology versus morality versus aesthetics, because the appropriate procedures for assessment are just so profoundly different. What counts as a good argument, valid evidence, or a legitimate conclusion in one field might be totally inappropriate, even meaningless, in another. Toulmin even notes that philosophy itself can have different interests, some aiming for universal principles, others focusing on practical application and the nuances of reasoning in specific contexts.
So it's about practical criticism, not just abstract rules.
Precisely. This perspective emphasizes the huge importance of practical criticism and how it differs from purely formal, abstract analysis. It means understanding that the logical form of an argument, its structure and rules, is deeply tangled up with its social form, that is, the context, the purpose, the community, the domain where it's being made. So when you encounter a claim, don't just ask, is this true, in some vague universal sense. Instead, dig deeper. Ask, what kind of truth is this claim asserting? What field does it belong to? By what specific standards is this argument being judged? And crucially, are those standards actually appropriate for this particular field? That's the real challenge and the powerful insight Toulmin offers for navigating our incredibly complex information landscape. Hashtag outro.
Wow. What an incredible deep dive into the very, nuts and bolts of how we argue, how we assess claims. We've really journeyed from the simple act of just making an assertion through all those diverse fields where arguments actually live and breathe, explore the fascinating stages arguments tend to go through as they develop, unravel the subtle but really powerful meanings of those modal words like possible and cannot, and discover that absolutely crucial difference between the term's underlying force and the specific criteria for applying it in different contexts. You, the listener, now hopefully have a much richer framework to understand the often hidden architecture that underlies the arguments swirling around us.
And this really raises an important question for you to maybe mull over as you go about your day. In a world that's just overflowing with information, where every headline, every post, every opinion seems to demand your attention, how might understanding this field dependence of arguments fundamentally change how you engage with different sources of knowledge? And what might you gain by asking not just the simple question, is this true? But digging a bit deeper and asking, by what specific standards is this argument being judged, and are those standards actually appropriate for its particular field and reference? It's a shift in perspective that can, I think, really transform how you think critically about, well, pretty much everything around you.